All right, everyone. Again, this is Todd Kuramoto from Ellipse Solutions. We are going to begin. So let me start the presentation. Hopefully you are at the right webinar. So what we're going to do today is cover the journey before you go live to Dynamics 365, what that really entails, the various tools. And then we're going to talk about a pretty radical change, and it's all under terms and labels like Evergreen, OneVersion, continuous updates. It's really, really an important change to the architecture and the way in which people can migrate or more easily upgrade to the most current version of Dynamics 365. So let's get started. For those that are unfamiliar with Ellipse Solutions, a few things. First things first, Todd Kuramoto, Ellipse Solutions. I've been with the company for about 4 years, and I'm in business development. Now, about Ellipse Solutions, though, 24 years in ERP consulting. That dates us back to the mid-90s. We did ERP type of recommendations for clients. We also did implementations, traditionally as more of a project manager. Go forward 13 years to the mid-2000s, 2006. And at that time, we decided to be an implementer and provide consulting services, training, etc. So we decided to ride the Dynamics horse. In 2006, the version really that was being shipped was AX4. And we're proud that we made that decision. Alongst the way, you should know that we also have a recruiting organization where we literally have thousands of Dynamics consultants in it. And as well, employees like yourself. Now, it's not traditional for people to highlight the fact that we have one former customer. But along the way, we've done dozens of implementations. And we've only walked away from one implementation, and we did so mutually. And the reasoning was really, really simple. We're very structured in our approach. And in this case, we just had a fundamental difference with the client, who was very, very understanding, remains friendly to us. As a matter of fact, they occasionally ping some of our architects that they worked with. So we understood why they couldn't do it like we really have done it for years and very, very successfully. But moving forward, so the 9/5/16, so that is September or Labor Day weekend of 2016. That was our first go live. We're proud to say that that was probably amongst the first, 25 Dynamics 365, or it was called AX7 at the time, go lives worldwide, right? And the reason this is relevant is because since then, there have been no fewer than 6 primary application updates, and I think we're on our 26th platform update. You couple that with, we have the most AppSource applications. AppSource is the Microsoft Marketplace that is curated and overseen by Microsoft. So it's a very kind of a rigorous process. So our background and experience from an application and platform update, and even from a Microsoft escalation perspective, is pretty significant. And then the bottom row, over 60 employees, over 50 of those are billable, including architects, developers, business analysts, project managers, etc., infrastructure people. We're very proud of the certifications, and we feel that continuing education is one of the primary reasons that we are successful. We just don't cut corners, and this is one area that we are resolute that our consultants stay up to date. In the 5+ years, I think it's 5 of the last 6 or 6 out of the last 7, we've been designated as the best places to work. And we do that because we take care of our employees, right? So in the IT world, consulting, this is a really, really pretty darn good statistic. So let me just highlight, I'm not going to highlight all of this. I already talked a little bit about the go live, which is in kind of the 4th bullet there. But at the top, going back over 4 years ago, we were invited, maybe one of 25 vendors, up to Microsoft, where they gave us a sneak preview of the product, right? So we are absolutely respected from that perspective. I already talked about the app source applications. And when you look at the bottom, the AXUG note, please understand that if you are part of an AXUG chapter or part of Summit or part of that overall organization, we love to support AXUG. So we do so. And if you look over the course of about the last 3 years, I honestly do not think that there is another vendor that has provided more content from an AXUG perspective as far as presentations. And these are everything from very highly technical presentations to presentations that are more timely, kind of like this webinar intends to be. So here's the agenda. So the first 3 bullets are kind of preparation for in an outline of kind of the process of either re-implementing or upgrading to Dynamics 365. And then the last 2 are posts. And there's some really, really important, really newsworthy events that have occurred literally in the last week. So I've given that last presentation, the bottom section, a few times to AXUG, and I'm not embarrassed because things change so rapidly, but they have changed. My point being that what I presented about a month ago in Indianapolis or a month and a half ago in Ohio has changed, right? So that's the way, that's the world in which we live. So let's move on to the actual upgrade or re-implementation if you're coming from AX 2009. So first and foremost, from a data migration perspective, this is complex. And the reason it's complex is because the move to AX 2012 involved some radical database changes. The database became highly normalized. It just meant that it went up by 2x, 3x as far as the number of tables, which makes any data migration just far, far more difficult when you're trying to extract, transform, and load things into things that have branched out like that with still the same, even more dependencies, right? There's still a data analyzer tool that does provide some benefit, especially because the tool allows you to move more kind of static type information. I'll get into that a little bit more in the next slide. You have to re-examine all your customizations, whether you want to or not. And the reason is pretty simple. Number one, you should rationalize them anyway. But the other is because even if you could migrate your customizations, guess what? You got a problem. And the problem is the architecture has changed. The architecture has changed from overlayering or basically going into the actual Microsoft source code and modifying that versus extensions, which are basically callouts. And it's a really, really good thing. It's a great change, and I'll talk more about that when we get to the OneVersion portion. And when you consider that 2009 is a version that's 10 years old, guess what? There's a lot of functionality differences. There's a lot of deprecation of either functionally or from a data perspective, right? So, hate to say it, but if you're coming from 2009, what we call an upgrade is more or less a technical upgrade. It's kind of just moving from one environment to another environment. It's really not practical or possible for 2009 users. So when I talked about data before, here's where you can have help, right? So, and this makes a lot of sense. Items that are more static in nature, or that which from like an accounting purpose perspective are just really, really important to have things that are really open, account balances, summary type information updated so that as these open transactions complete and journal postings are completed, that you can maintain from a truly an accounting perspective the right records and the right information. There's other more static information related to system configuration. And when we talk about entities, please understand that from an integration and data perspective, data entities has really replaced AIF. So that framework has been deprecated, and now data entities is really the way in which data especially flows into and out of Dynamics 365. Now, this will probably look familiar because this is taken directly from Lifecycle Services, right? We bring this up because, again, this is part of the standard process and steps that you would go through as you look to really re-implement the Dynamics 365 from AX 2009. There's nothing really unusual about this. It's just a stepwise procedure, and this is really mimicking what you would see in Lifecycle Services. So let's go to AX 2012 now. And I know this is pretty high level, but at the end of the day, you'd really need to get with a partner to really dive down and dig into any of these elements in a lot more detail. So fortunately, or unfortunately, depends how you look at it, I guess, there is a data migration tool that allows you to move transaction data as well. Right, so remember what I said before, that in AX 2009 to 2012, there was a pretty radical database change, becoming far more normalized. Well, the good news is, at least from R2 or R3, you now have the ability to migrate transaction data as well, right? So if that's really the way in which you're going to go, fantastic, it's available to you. Because you have dual use rights by going to Dynamics 365, another option for transaction or historical information is to retain access to those environments, right, truly for that transaction type information. You also have the options of creating a data warehouse as well. I don't want to dive into any of those are separate conversations, but you do have some of those capabilities. When you look at the code conflict reports and examine time and effort, we say this with some hesitation, right? So the conflict report is good as far as identifying areas that should be reconciled. The examine time and effort is, it's not very credible, I guess. In some cases, they have time and effort, 10 minutes or 15 minutes. And it's hard to imagine even opening up an environment, looking at code, et cetera, before actually making the change in that requisite time. We have gone through these reports and modified a lot of the time and effort. And it's not just because we're a consultant that we're doing that. We just think it should be more realistic, right? So I mentioned before, architecture has changed, and it's really changed for the good. And that's going to extensions, which are these callouts, which means that the originating source code really does not get modified. So you can still have some functional conflicts. Obviously, if you have a call out to an extension that has some functional modification that then is kind of where you have a conflict with a new functional improvement made by Microsoft, right? So there's still that possibility, but the old code conflict type of resolution you really shouldn't have. It's one of the primary points of the new extensions architecture. I talked a little bit about AIF as opposed to data entities, and from a BI strategy, one of the big changes is embedded Power BI, right? So as part of your Dynamics 365 subscription, you have the ability, and there are some pre-built workspaces that include embedded Power BI visualizations. Because this comes with your subscription, because it is being fed by a high-end SQL database, uses column indexing, in-memory computing, etc. It really should be part of the overall strategy when you're going through your upgrade. So this again is more of an LCS view of the various steps. You know, the one part that I really don't want to underestimate or understate is kind of the fit gap, the front end of all of this. You really have a unique opportunity here to really think about the to-be, and not necessarily, unless you're really one of the AX 2012 environments that really just upgraded within the last few years, right? That fit gap, there's so much change going on. You know, I looked at the new release document recently, and it was over 400 pages long, and there were links everywhere, meaning that the document was actually literally in the thousands of pages if you encapsulated all those links and all the additional information. My point being is it's hard to keep track of all this. Good partners, though, they'll have a good understanding of your environment, of the process, etc., and they can help guide you to the things and remind you or highlight those areas where they think you might see value in the future, just because they know your business and your processes so straightforward. So I have another view of this, and the only reason that this is helpful is because it helps you understand some things that will be done in parallel versus sequentially. It really is the same slide as before, but at the end, it's just another way of presenting it. And same thing with the LCS view, right? So that's enough about some of the tools that are available, but at the end, one of the decisions you're going to make is, should I go through a technical upgrade? Again, that's just like moving what you got without much rationalization, bringing forth your customizations, right? Versus a reimplementation that starts truly with a fit gap, where you can start with a clean slate, ensure that any gaps really require a customization. Maybe there's a business process that can be modified. So we're going to look at this in different kind of categories. So the first is from a strategy or an ROI. And I think this makes a lot of sense, right? Especially if you're not coming from a really late version of AX 2012 R3. And the reason is simple, right? So when D365 was originally released, remember we talked about that, it was about, what, 2.5 years ago, end of 2016. The functionality was very, very, very similar between AX 2012 R3, C, or whatever, and Dynamics 365. If you put a Venn diagram up, it would be darn near overlapping. And even for the first year, it stayed pretty consistent, but the divergence has been pretty remarkable over the last year, 18 months, right? So if you're looking at it from an upgrade perspective, you can look at it as just a technical exercise. It definitely will be less costly. There's absolutely zero doubt about that. But if you're really looking at it from a more strategic perspective, almost no matter what release you're coming from, it's really important that you go through that fit gap exercise and really consider a reimplementation, right? If you really want to get the most bang up for your buck, going through an implementation which has some fixed costs, and the variable costs as you begin to go through the various modules or even new modules, again, it's just layering on things where you can justify it in your head, right? So it might not even make it into phase 1, but it's still a good exercise so that you go, okay, so this is a phase 2 item, and at the end, it makes sense to do this after the initial go live. Now, we have accounts that have literally thousands of customizations. It's just not unusual for our clients to have used AX in the past as at least partially a development environment, right? So, you still need to consider these things. So when the volume is such that it really helps justify just a technical upgrade, by all means, it should be considered, versus the reimplementation, and it's not necessarily the total number. It's easy to kind of want to have a binary way of considering this, but often it's kind of like, well, the number of modifications isn't that many, but they're still pretty complex, right? It still should be re-rationalized, reconsidered when you're going through that reimplementation exercise. Because of the changes and the additions, as an example, or from an ISV perspective, Microsoft is constantly adding new technology that they've basically OEM'd from partners, right? We've seen it in warehouse management, or now advanced warehouse management. It might be in the area of enterprise asset management. Right, so at the end, what you have, there could be something like, RF Smart, which it's a good solution, et cetera, but it's got its place. So you got to make sure that the new system doesn't really cover the vast majority of what you need. Right? So, and if it does, it might make sense not to continue forth with a specific ISV, independent software vendor. Right, so at the end, this just remains a section that should be considered as you're really going through this process of technical upgrade, which is just bringing it across, versus a reimplementation where you're kind of re-rationalizing things and really trying to layer in what Microsoft has. From a data perspective, there are cases where the data upgrade tools will be very, very effective. Again, we're kind of highlighting if you run in 2012, R2 or R3, et cetera, it should absolutely be considered. On the other hand, if you're running all other environments, it is very, very, very likely that you'll have to go through the whole of what we've stated here on the reimplementation side, including the consideration for building a data warehouse, which is generally the way in which most of our clients are going. There's the code side. And when we say quality, what becomes difficult is when things are not documented well, right? So imagine it's almost like garbage in, garbage out, right? So if you don't have great quality of documentation and you're going through a technical upgrade, just realize you might be taking something that is adding zero value or maybe is even incorrect and moving it forward. Versus from a reimplementation standpoint, it's just kind of following best practices to have well-documented information. And even if you do carry forth a customization, it is another opportunity to make sure you have documented it, right? So the reimplementation process really helps guide you. If you carry it forth, still have an opportunity to make sure that the quality of the documentation is good. But if you're going through a technical upgrade, it's kind of just saying, hey, we're just going to move it forward without real consideration of any of that. Integrations always have to be considered because every one of our clients have some integrations. The classic examples are for banking, bank reconciliation, POSIPay, et cetera, right? There might be for EDI, et cetera. So these are just another areas where you have to look at your current environment, moving forward, and really re-rationalizing things, or looking at the new ways in which integrations may occur, and ensuring that products really support the new architecture for this integration. I've talked a little bit about documentation from a code quality perspective. The one thing I will say is, and we'll touch upon this, is you really have an opportunity to improve documentation, not just of customizations. That's definitely a little bit more manual. But from a learning and training perspective, having the business process modeler and task recordings is just it really is a very, very good highlight of Dynamics 365 to really ramp up and complete those things and really follow more of a best practices method. And then new features. Obviously, there's a lot that has been added. I kind of talked and highlighted about that. There are going to be cases where maybe you have such kind of a unique environment, business, industry that you can't take advantage, but it's probably highly unlikely that you wouldn't still find value in a reimplementation of going through a complete fit gap to really understand where there are things in the new environment, Dynamics 365, that might be beneficial. So I'm going to fly through the licensing update. As I look down, I see I'm almost a half hour in, because the other part is it's constantly changing, like I mentioned, and I really need to get to that pretty quickly. So if I go through too quickly here, again, just text in your questions, and we'll make sure we follow up on each and every one of these things. So first and foremost, you have to know what you're going to. Dynamics 365 uses a named licensing subscription model. And I've layered in from 2012, since X 2012 also uses a named user licensing model. So the good news is it's pretty simple to understand how conversions will occur. Right? So there are some options though. And what I want to get to is existing customers get discounts. So here's an important, I didn't put it on the takeaways. I do have a takeaway slide, but know this, that there is discussion of the discounts for existing AX clients that are moving to Dynamics 365, either going away, which makes no sense because they'll lose all their annual maintenance revenue, or the discount being changed. And roughly what's happening is things are being discounted like 40 to 50 or 60% because they're trying to reward you for having paid maintenance all those years. So number one, make sure you've paid your maintenance, and if you haven't, you'll live with whatever you get, right? So, but this is discussed being eliminated in the fall release around October, November, right? So just detail that. We have clients that have gone ahead and converted from a licensing perspective to Dynamics 365 subscriptions because they were able to negotiate a very good rate for these subscriptions, not incrementally add much to what they're paying in annual maintenance, but with the assurance that when they go to Dynamics 365, that they're not left with a bad discount and paying a lot more. And I hate to say this, but 3 years, I can understand Microsoft's part. It's their way of creating a milestone and trying to get people to move more quickly. So just keep that in mind. And how you buy some that are large enough, over 500 seats, and that's for, say, like Office 365, et cetera. You might be an enterprise agreement client versus buying through CSP, which stands for Cloud Solution Provider. I'm not going to get into the differences. Suffice it to say, an EA provides great discounts, does kind of lock you in for 3 years. You generally have to start paying from day one. So just keep all that in mind, that even the simplest of implementations probably take 3 to 6 months, right? And that would be more of a technical upgrade versus a reimplementation. So from 2009, it's a little bit more complicated because 2009 uses a concurrent use model. The one thing I'm going to say, though, is just work with your partner. Your partner will know the right way of getting you quotes as to what this would cost and helping you negotiate with Microsoft regarding discounts, et cetera. Right? The earlier you do this, honestly, the better off you'll be. right? So, and at one point, Microsoft was treating these almost like new licenses as far as how they were kind of rewarding the sales reps. So again, I would just encourage you to try to do that sooner than later. And these are the conversions on the previous side, sorry. These are roughly the conversions from AX 2009 licenses to Dynamics 365. And then likewise, from a 2012 perspective, those are the conversions. I'll just spend a moment on on-premise. We do have a client that has moved to the on-premise. It is nice. You're just continue to pay annual maintenance, really, unless the number of users really begins to swell. You should be fine from a subscription perspective because you're not paying anything for quote, the infrastructure piece, and the annual maintenance really covers the conversion to the various subscription types in Dynamics 365. Just know that your infrastructure costs, whatever you estimated them to be, will be more. We were pretty surprised at trying to emulate a cloud architecture and environment at the number of VMs that are really required. Also know that there are things like the Internet of Things or machine learning or Power BI that are really embedded in some of the workspaces. Not yet available, unknown if, when they will be available. And then, of course, your DR, your disaster recovery or high availability, those things as well. And it's not restored to the second. I think it's restored to the 5 seconds, as I know what the DR service levels are for a Dynamics 365 environment. That's a typo, I think. And then the availability aspects of being in the cloud. And I'm going to kind of just cover the second item. To get started, just know that you have to buy 20 subscriptions, the highest right subscriptions for getting started in the cloud. And those run street price, $190 per user per month. 20 times 190 is 3,800 times 12. The cost to get started is just shy of $50,000 per year. But that's what's really required to kind of get started and get your implementation going. Right now, if you have a lot more users, this is when that exercise of really investigating your enterprise agreement and some of the timing of payments becomes really, really important. And of course, we would say just run numbers. This is spreadsheet time. It's a matter of really understanding which expenses are going to be required when by an EA versus a cloud solution provider that allows you to kind of ramp up, ramp down, and a lot more flexibility, but really not much wiggle room from a price negotiation perspective. And that you can use both, right? So let me talk a little bit about your takeaways. I like this because if somebody asks you, you attended the webinar, what are your takeaways? You don't have to take these, but I think this is really valuable. There are a lot of things to consider. There are tools available. You really have to know and understand your environment, kind of pros and cons of just kind of moving things forward, technical upgrade versus a full reimplementation. You need to really consider what your future looks like, right? And from the other criteria, there are cost elements to everything, right? And there's timing to everything as well. So that's that first checklist item. Just because we have labeled things as a technical upgrade versus reimplementation doesn't mean that it doesn't kind of blend both, right? There are things that will just, will move forward, whatever that can be kind of considered that portion of technical upgrade versus areas that you need to really do the full fit gap and really go through rationalized customizations, all the integrations, et cetera. That's the reimplementation part. So a hybrid approach makes sense. We don't really want to make it sound like you got to be jammed into one of these boxes. And then we can't emphasize enough the best practices, just following the good process so that when you're completed, you really feel like you're going to get out of the system what is most important to you. Right? All right, so I'm going to move on now to OneVersion. And parts of this I'm going to fly through too, but this is how this agenda looks like. I'm going to try to spend a little bit more time on the latter half of this, at least the bottom three, because the top three, or the top one, I want to cover because it's a little bit, I wouldn't say funny, but it does help understand why it's not just you, by the way. This is for SAP, this is for Oracle. Truly enterprise ERPs have had the same issue. You purchase an ERP, you see all these nice shiny objects, as in features that come out. And while you could take advantage of them, the cost to kind of upgrade is a deterrent, right? So now a few years have passed and the cost of this has gotten even worse. And this is what management says. You're going to tell me after spending X dollars of money, and often it's in the millions of dollars, you're going to tell me this is going to cost, best case, a few $100,000, and you are going to have to either hire people or your people are going to have to work more hours to really get this in. Not to mention you have business disruption as well, subject matter experts. This is not just an IT thing. So what is the compromise? You need to do something to keep pace with your environment, the business requirements. Management is still really anti-upgrade again. So you do the easier thing. I've told you, we have clients that have made thousands, literally thousands of customizations. And because it can be used as a development platform, and because the customizations, if they were done correctly, were built in AX, guess what? It just is easy and simple. But this has ended up recurring again and again and again, right? So hopefully, I don't know if this will play. This is supposed to be from Christmas Vacation. That's Chevy Chase. This is the environment which has been created. So this is a little bit humorous. But again, this is not just you. This is SAP, this is Oracle. You have become version locked. And it was so easy and simple to start. Each step along the way, though, it's almost like the old days when they called things like spaghetti code. But this is really what you've created. It just makes it harder and harder to take all the customizations, integrations, third-party solutions that have used this overlayered model and then re-rationalize things and, quote, re-implement, right? So I'm painting a pretty miserable picture. But this is the general result of what's happened. Pressure is really built, right? And now it's beginning to culminate in what is basically a TCO nightmare. Most organizations are able to kind of skate by this whole thing. But these costs, even technical upgrades, are often around a third of the cost of the original implementation. And the business disruption is really very, very, very real, right? So there's opportunity costs. There's all sorts of elements that have made getting to this point really pretty painful. So what is the Microsoft's response? We call it the Microsoft dream. And you've probably heard those terms, Evergreen ERP, continuous update, OneVersion. Well, here's the long and short of it. And I've just noticed a typo because of changes that have literally occurred in the last week. So Evergreen ERP or OneVersion is Microsoft's response. I won't go on a wild diversion here, but I like to think of this as a way to compete with single tenant software as a service applications. So think of the Salesforce, right? You know, they update at whatever cadence, they update everyone, right? So, and I've heard from many people it's really a non-event, right? So this is the way Microsoft is really competing with that, right? It's still multi-tenant, but they've architected it in a way where now they're purporting to be able to run these updates with just a cadence that seems unbelievable. And the minor fixes and functionality tweaks every month, that is now being changed to every 45 days on average. And I've got a slide that shows what the sequence will be. And they're calling them service updates. And when we talk about major functionality additions every 6 months, so still think of spring and fall. So we just went through a spring release in April. The next, quote, major functionality release will be right around October, right? So as we go through this, though, here's what the original reaction was from the Dynamics community. How the heck are we going to be able to do all the testing? When we go through an implementation, testing takes weeks to complete, right? And now you're talking about going through this testing on a monthly, or in this case, for every 45 days. And what about the disruption? How are we going to take people that are being hired in one aspect and dedicate them to testing? So the disruption aspect is very, very, very real. So I don't know if this will give you comfort, but what I'm going to go through now is the ways in which Microsoft tests. And this is not just for Dynamics, by the way. This is across really all their products, right? So they have what's called a feature team. So this is not really officially the full finance and ops team. What's important to note, though, is they take a very pragmatic approach as far as the way that they go through new releases and new release testing, right? So Ring 0 is just that. It's the smallest sample size, but it's a number of very technically competent testing professionals, right? Then they layer in their official finance and ops team, and that includes retail, by the way. And then when you get into Ring 2 and preview, that's where you can participate. Now, why would you consider doing that? Well, the reason you'd consider doing that is you'll have probably a full 60 days before the product is released, and you'll have access to Dynamics 365 engineers. Right, so this is an important aspect for it. As Microsoft begins to really understand the idea of testing, they truly want that circle to be as wide as it can be, right? Because they can't test everything. I'm going to say that repeatedly throughout this whole thing. You can't test everything. So your best bet is to begin trying to make the best intentional decisions. So this is one of those decisions where they open it up in preview, and you have to apply, they have to accept you, et cetera, but there is no reason why they, in general, would not accept you. But then there's that Ring 3 and Ring 4. Ring 4 is really when it is generally released, right? So we are now on, I believe, 10.0.2, and you just need to know the various ways in which Microsoft goes about their testing. It's not perfect. I've said it already 3 or 4 times. You can't test everything, and I'm going to emphasize that point. It's not perfect. So this report is due out in the summer. That's the best I can get from a very good Microsoft architect that responds to me regularly and very, very quickly. But what is it, right? So what it is is the churn part is the Microsoft code that has really been changed in the new release, right? So think about this logically. When you think about things that might break, you got to start looking at things that have changed, right? So you have from a code perspective, you've got ISV. Right, so for your first go live, I really don't know what real access they have or how much they take that into consideration. But after you've gone live, for sure, they're collecting actual usage. So you can see those circles begin to identify areas that you're using the system. Kind of makes some sense here, right? So at the end of the day, they're providing this because they know, what have I said repeatedly? You can't test everything. You need to be intentional and fairly intelligent about the framework and where you're going to test, right? So I hate to say it, because at the end of the day, you should expect that there's going to be things that are the test fails, right? You just need to walk in with that expectation. If it passes everything, if there's no problems, and guess what? You should just be delighted. And I'm not trying to be doom and gloom, but from an expectation standpoint, you might as well walk in with that expectation. So what are some of the tools here that are available? So there are code tools and data upgrade tools. These are things that help identify, as an example, deprecated, whether they're methods or I can't recall all the components from an X++ perspective. Same thing from a data. For the most part, we're finding things that are deprecated versus, I forgot the other term, where it's basically gone away, right? So just because it's deprecated doesn't mean that it has gone away, right? So you're usually given up to a year's notice for from a deprecated data perspective. So that's very, very valuable. It just means you don't have to do things right away, but you have to start planning for it, right? Depending on your use of said deprecated areas. And a lot has been written about the regression suite. It's an automation tool. It relies on, and I'll cover this in another slide here. It really requires on the business process modeler and the task recordings. But there's something else that has been added, and it's in the 10.0.2 release, and it's called the acceptance test library. It's X++ based, and it is very, 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 I won't say technical, but I will say that it will allow you to test things whereby if the area warrants it, it's your best option, right? I've just heard from technical resources that say when you begin to layer over the areas that you're going to test, you then need to decide, are you going to do it using the regression suite tool? Are you going to create one of these automated test libraries, and it comes with like 5,000 of these things that you can kind of repurpose? Or are you going to manually test? And there are going to be examples where, I hate to say it, but you're going to have to manually test certain areas. And when we talk about performance testing, this is not, the latency for running a specific transaction, whatever. This is a way to stress test your environment. So this allows you to go in, and if you have just some cyclical, very transaction-sensitive periods of time, the easiest example is to talk about retail and Black Friday and the subsequent 35 days. That's the things that you would need to use from a performance testing perspective. So remember, from an automated code upgrade perspective, there's no more extensions as of 8.0. This happened at the end of 2018. Code's been sealed, and bottom line, if you tried to overlay something, or if you had overlayered code, it just simply would not compile. So, but the upgrade tool is available to help you identify, again, what we've seen mostly are areas where things have been deprecated, right? In general, the way in which extensions work, and as far as really sealing code and avoiding those types of conflicts, has worked. It's worked really, really well. And we can say that not just from a customer perspective, but because we have our own app source applications where we've had to do our own testing and ensure that our applications continue to work fine. I mentioned that there's a data upgrade tool. Remember that the data upgrade tool is back. It sounds like I just lost audio and I'm back. Okay. So the data upgrade tool is available, and I'll just say it again. On one hand, I'm talking about a little bit, you should expect problems. On the other hand, our experience in this area has the data upgrade tool has identified things, but again, it's been more things that have been deprecated. So from a testing perspective, this is kind of what's available to you. So the tools that you really have, I probably should have put manual testing in there as another item on that top. The BPMs and task recordings are really part of the regression testing automated suite tool, right? I've talked about the performance testing tool and the test libraries. Right. So, and I'm going to get into a little bit more about what we found here as we wrap this up. So remember I said by mistake we had a typo on that one slide that said these things are monthly. Here's how Microsoft is intending to do this. And I think it's their way of understanding that an update a month is a lot. And having only 2 pauses or forcing people to update quarterly is too much. Honestly, it's just unnecessary. So this is what they're morphing to, and 8 updates delivered per year. Interestingly, in my opinion, it kind of syncs up with their platform updates. Platform updates, if you've been following along, have been on about 8 times a year since they began over about 3.5 years ago. They're on platform update 26 right now, so you can do the math, right? Times 3.5, guess what? It is 28, so by October, if they hit 28, then it's really exactly on, spot on. Every 45 days they have a platform update, right? So they're just blending in. Service updates will have those functional changes as well, the application changes, etc. The platform updates have typically been more kind of kernel-oriented type updates. So just rest assured. So the other important element is you can pause 3 times. Pausing 3 times means that, guess what? You can skip up to, or you can have between updates 6 months, right? Far better than the original, we're going to have to update every month, or worst case every quarter. That's a lot, right? Given that, and it's a lot for Microsoft as well. So I think the realization was both practical from their side, is what they'd call it, but I think this will ease some tension. Oh boy. Hey, sorry about that. Looked like audio has been reconnected. So Microsoft has talked about only supporting what they call N-1, like the release -1. We're still trying to get confirmation as to if that is one of these kind of point releases or these minor updates that occur 8 times a year, or truly if it's per like more major update, that which comes, spring and fall. So we would, in general, suggest that you have take a look at the release notes. It's hard to really figure out impact unless you have an idea of what's changing. You should consider becoming part of that pre-release or preview program. I just mentioned the delay up to 6 months. It's important to know new features are turned off, so you're not going to get any hopeful surprises from users that say, I'm seeing the screen and it's giving me this new weird capability that I didn't have before. And from an ISV perspective, they're still claiming that this will be backwards compatible. We find that very, very interesting that they would purport that. So, and in the interest of time, I'm going to try to speed through a couple of these. Remember how I said, let me just take a look at the center slide. Best practices. Okay. So because the regression suite is so dependent on task recordings, there's something that's really, really important to consider. When you're implementing task recordings, are generally a learning type of task, right? And it's excellent for that, honestly. The way in which you're guided, or you could print these things out, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a very, very cool tool, but it's not built for testing, right? So testing a process and really marking it as pass, fail, et cetera, it just has different requirements, right? So there's a reasonable chance you can take the original task recordings and then modify those, but just don't be confused or don't underestimate the fact that you're going to have to do some additional work from a task recording perspective, right? We're just promoting something. This is pretty selfish, but I'm going to go ahead and say it. We see the need for all this, and as I'm going to say, you can do everything perfect and still have a problem. Honestly, this is both art and science, and what we've done, though, is we have a number of steps that we think will mitigate risk, right? And as well as just being affordable and predictable, right? So, but what are your takeaways? Told you 5 to 10 times, you can't test everything. Another typo. The plan will change and need updating. Processes change. So guess what? This is something you have to be really, really, really intelligent about. That's where that usage report will be really helpful. That's where knowing where Microsoft has churned things will be really, really helpful. Knowing your customizations and all that, it is very important that you're intentional. Now, I will tell you this, though. You can do all that and think, oh, I just have to test really those like areas of code that have changed, right? What we found is there's sometimes some underlying background process that occurs where you could never anticipate that the thing would break or that it would not work as planned, right? So I'm just telling you in advance that some of the manual testing that you should do for specific processes should be done just that way. Or another example is MRP and net requirements, right? You really need to manually test this and validate that you're getting the results that you feel you should get. So knowing your usage and what has changed, it's kind of going back to that report. And again, this is not perfect. This is art and science. This is kind of the science part, and then also using some somewhat gray area considerations from a testing perspective. When I say understand the available tools, remember you got the performance tool, you got the regression suite, you have manual testing, and you have those automated test libraries. Really understanding what should be used for what purpose and frequency, what level of detail, what at the end of the day just makes some common sense. Simple example of that is there may be some things that you could do using the automated test libraries, but it's like building something to automatically load something where you're loading 5 records and you're doing it every 3 months, right? At the end of the day, it doesn't make sense to build like a script for something like that. And it makes sense from this perspective as well, right? So it's a matter of taking all the available tools and mitigating risk. And the last but not least is test early. Test early and often, right? So at the end, this is a binary process for Microsoft, right? When you inform them, I didn't get into how this is all scheduled through LCS and all that. It's kind of a rote process. But we have had examples where something failed, we notified Microsoft, they still put it into production, right? So at the end, it's still a binary decision. But the earlier you test, if you have an escalation plan, et cetera, the better off you'll be to mitigate risk. In that case I just mentioned, at the end of the day, what we had to do is basically say, don't do this, which is not a very good answer, right? But at the end, we don't have full control of it. Microsoft has their process, but the earlier you test, the earlier you know what your escalation process will be, the better off you'll be as far as avoiding something that may end up really biting you in the butt. So I know I'm a few minutes over. I would ask you to mail in any questions that you have, and we promise we will get back to you within a day. But I want to thank everyone for attending today. I really, really appreciate it. And the world is shifting, but it's a good shift. Honestly, the impact that this will make long-term and being able to use the functionality that Microsoft is delivering on a monthly basis is really unprecedented. So have a wonderful day, and thanks once again for joining me today.